I'd like to start every time with to look at our core values, but I really want to share something personal today. The human hands solve human problems. Yesterday, our dear friends CB and Kevin came to our home. And many of you probably don't know, but our house was kind of destroyed by some contractors, and it's kind of in a rough situation. And they came in, and Kevin, thank you so much, Kevin. He set the toilet in my bathroom, our bathroom. So we have 2 whole toilets in our house now. And thank you, Kevin. Human hands solve human problems. Your dear friends, thank you. And anyway, I got to visit with CB too. So that was really nice. We had a really wonderful day. So thank you guys. Before I introduce our most illustrious Dr. Eric Schmitt, who is going to tell us more about his theory, I want to share, in the spirit of Luke Cana, I'm going to share a joke that my husband told me on the way in, and I hope you guys will all know what we're talking about, because the youngins, sorry, y'all probably won't. So what is a sheep's favorite comic strip? Mutt and Jeff. Mutt and Jeff, remember? We missed that. Anyway, so without further ado, we're going to have our third presentation, a kind of a summary of his theory. We are also going to be able to do a recording of a longer presentation he has, and we're going to post it on our social media. And so we're very excited to welcome Eric Schmitt up to the podium again.
Thank you. So the plan is to just present an overview of what we've already seen and peek at what's coming up for a third talk. But at the end, it'll be opened up. There should be plenty of time for questions. Okay, so who here has been asked, well, if there is not a God, where did the universe come from? Thank you. So anybody here? Yeah, we've all gotten that question, probably within about 2 minutes of telling somebody that you're an atheist, right? If there isn't a God, where did the universe come from? Okay. Well, neither side has a very good explanation, in my opinion. Obviously, if you say there's a God, that just postpones the question, where God come from. But in terms of understanding really how you get something from nothing is a really challenging question. It's the big question. So it could be that we lack the capacity to understand the origin of the universe, but I don't think so. I suspect that's not the case. However, it is asking too much. It's a bit naive to think that you're going to grasp that answer without getting some background, some context of physics to help you understand the model. So I'll summarize the high points, the main points from the 2 preceding talks, and then I'm sorry, but you're gonna have to trust me for the stuff that comes from the third talk that I'm not going to have the opportunity today to present the context and evidence for. But that'll be in a future talk. Okay, so in terms of going from nothing to something, this theory starts with the assumption that the current model of particle physics is incomplete, that there's some more basic foundation. This isn't a new idea. There is a term for such a fundamental unit that everything's built from. So, going down from molecules to atoms to protons to quarks and keep on going. And so that more fundamental thing is a prion. Where does the prion from? By definition, and I really want this to sink in, most fundamental building block will not be built from anything else, by definition. right? And the properties we observe are going to have to be emergent properties. So whatever is at that foundation has to do double duty. It has to be both nothing and something. And you've got to somehow span that gulf between the two. So in the dream model, the postulate is that mathematical points are at the root of all of this. They are nothing. They're an abstract concept. But you can also look at a mathematical point as a balance of dimensions. It's where all the dimensions balance off. And what I'm proposing is that there was a phase change in the universe where you went from an infinite field of mathematical points to released dimensions. And those dimensions are the same stuff of string theory. And that when they associate with one another, you begin to see properties. So starting out, mathematical field of point, and then you have this phase transition that releases the strings. If you take this set of three axes, you'll actually get orthogonal like the model needs. We need 3D prions in order to build a 3D universe. One way could have happened is that there could have been phase change. So that, in quantum mechanics, there's some probability that the prion could be outside that point. That's one way. Another way is to think that they're all paired up somehow in the point, and that just by exchanging where their pairings go, one was accidentally released. And so with the birth of the universe that way. They assemble. Well, the postulate is that the strings carry vibrations, and you can have constructive or destructive interference of waves. A vibration is a wave. And so like that's a bond. So the strings, I'm sorry, I keep cutting in and out here, but the strings build both space and particles. All right, we'll try this one. The strings are going to build both space and particles. So if you take that prion, it actually consists of one circular string that's folded. It's trifolded. That can unfold to make a closed loop string. And if you give that a full twist and fold the top and bottom on top of each other, you'll get what's known as a spinner, which is important to giving fermions their half spin. And it does a lot of other things in this model as I explored. And from those spinners, you could actually build conformable space. That is, again, not something that I've invented. That is part of loop quantum gravity theory that's been built up over many years. Going the other direction, you can take two of these prions, the red structure there, the three arms. And if you join two of them together, you get a photon. And the L-shaped pieces in this theory have charge. And when they move relative to each other, if you move charge relative to another charge, you generate an electromagnetic wave. So it would do that because it has a free rotational bond. And interestingly enough, that L-shaped piece shows up in our next structure. When we put three of these prions together, we get what actually is a good candidate for the color charge for the gluons. In standard model, the quarks are held together by gluons. The quarks have a color charge and the gluons have a color charge, and they exchange them, and that's what holds them together. It's a very complicated situation that they've come up with. I actually have the colors as particles. And so there's a red, green, and blue, and then there's one that's a multicolor as well, that it is its own antiparticle. but the L-shaped piece is on top of each one of those. If you take that L on top of the red and give it a twist, you'll end up with a green structure. And give it another twist, you'll get the blue. Give it another twist, you'll get that last structure. So that's how color oscillates. In the standard model, they've got these gluons changing color as they carry one color away and deliver another color to the next quark. Well, this is the color change mechanism. And the base, and it explains how, if they carry charge, how these have their glue property. The glue is the electric charge attraction between two of these colors. Bring two of them together, they stick by virtue of their L's on top of them. The base of the gluons are this parallel set of half bonds. And those are actually perfect for bonding to our next particle. When we stick 4 gluons together, we get the fermions. And so the quarks, which are the top 2 rows there, the orange and the yellow, have those parallel sets of half bonds. And you can join those again by constructive wave interference to the color charges. And you can also join the quarks directly to each other, which is not something that's in the standard model. In the standard model, they put the gluons between the quarks. I put the quarks together directly and put the color charges on the ends. And so I don't have to keep passing color around to keep everything balanced. So they have red, green, blue colors, which are by analogy because together they make white, and the particles they make, like the proton and the neutron, don't have a color charge, so it balances out. Well, on mine, I build these particles and I just put a color and an anti-color on each end, balanced out to white. Okay, so if you put 4 of these preons together, you get the structures. On the left are G1 fermions. If you put 12 of them together, you get the G2 fermions. It's just generation 2. They're just bigger. And if you put 16 together, you get to generation 3 fermions. You'll note that the ends, as you go across a row, stay the same. That's why they have the same properties. That's why in the standard model, they've been grouped together. But they're also bigger as you go from left to right. And that's explaining the increase in mass. Those increases in the size of the structure are related to the increase in mass. Also, between the generation 1 and generation 2 fermions, you get these dimers, which are shown on the far right. So 8 preons stuck together give you these dimers, and they actually have the right properties to be the force-carrying particles, the W plus, W minus, Z boson, and Higgs boson. So we went through all of this. So down at the bottom here, you can see more clearly the colors and their anti-colors. So in the dream model, we actually produce 3.5 pairs of color anti-color. It's a half because one of them is its own antiparticle. And that was tested against data here. So what they've done is they have looked at the products of collisions of positrons and electrons at various collision energies. And you get from that annihilation values that can tell you how many colors there are. So they're looking at the number of quarks. It's calculated it's based on both the points here, based on both on the number of quarks and the number of colors. So based on this, standard model concluded there were 3 colors. But so you start out, they thought that they were releasing 5 quarks, And that would mean 3 colors. So that was the black line there, 5 quarks, 3 colors. And they said, good enough. To me, they missed most points. And also, this is not a straight line, it's a curve. So I think what's happened is on the left, they've only released 4 quarks, the down, the up, the charm, and the strange and the charm quarks. As you go to the right, you release additionally the bottom quark. And when you get to the far right, you've released all of the quarks to the top quark. And so when I test that against 3 colors and 3.5 colors, the data for 3.5 colors, if you look at all those ones on the right that have 3.5 next to them, fit the line beautifully. Much better than the standard model fit. The dream model also provides a different mechanism for oscillation of neutrinos. So neutrinos are weird. If you produce some neutrinos at a source and then measure them at a detector, some of them have changed. By the time they get to the detector, you can go from an electron neutrino to a muon neutrino or a tauon neutrino. They have different masses, but despite that, the standard model says that what you really have is a superposition of particles that get resolved at the detector. I don't buy that. What's happening in my model is that the Z boson is combining with the neutrinos to produce the different flavors of neutrinos. So if you take the electron neutrino here on the pointer's not going to show you anything on the bottom left. So the electron neutrino plus the Z particle get you the muon neutrino shown above them. If you take that muon neutrino and combine it with Z, you get the tauon neutrino. So they oscillate by virtue of this weak connection through this single bond that hangs on. Now, you could, in theory, get a similar thing going on with W plus and W minus bosons, the W plus with the positively charged quarks and the W minus with the electron family. But that doesn't happen, and it doesn't happen because there's charge repulsion preventing it. The neutrinos are neutrally charged. So the spinner snugly fits into a particle square. And that's really important. The spinner physically confers half spin to the fermions. The lure out there is that, there can't really be physical spin because if the electron's charge radius was rotating, it would be rotating at more than the speed of light. But it turns out that's not what's rotating. What's rotating is a magnetic moment moving around that circle. And if you do that calculation, that electromagnetic moment is traveling exactly at the speed of light. That's what's traveling in these. It falls right out of the dream model. So the spinner also accounts for left and right chirality for both matter and for antimatter. And the spinner also takes, again, the notion of spin and makes it physical. Spinner also meets the criteria for dark matter. So like dark matter, the spinner does not interact with the strong, weak, or electromagnetic forces, but it has mass. The mass is a charge interaction between spinners. So, but because they are half spin, they can't superimpose. So they never meet, but they do pull towards each other. So if you build, most of the universe is built out of the generation 1 fermions. The proton, the up quark, the down quark, and the electron is most of what everything around you is. And to build those takes 5 strings. 4 for the structure and 1 for the spinner that sits inside. So that G1 particle, it could have used those 5 strings to make 5 dark matter spinners. And so that ratio means that And so if you look at all regular matter, the baryons, over all matter, the baryons plus the dark matter, that gives you a ratio of 1:6. Okay, 1:6. So 1 part normal matter, 5 parts dark. And that means that 16.6% of all matter is normal matter. That's exactly the number that's been determined by 3 different methods that have estimated the percentage of regular matter to dark matter in the universe. Falls out of the model. And then here's stuff that I didn't present to you yet. It's really where I got started with this is I noticed that you can calculate the rest mass of the generation 1 fermions as a ratio of charge. So if you take on the far right there, the charge of the electron, that's EQ, over the charge of the quark, and multiply that by the mass of the electron, you get the mass of the quark that you're trying to calculate, but you need to multiply by a factor of 3. I didn't know why that was at the time I observed it, and later came to realize that what that really is coming from is the shape of the preon. There are 3 half bonds in a string, and a string is going to produce 1 free half bond end sticking off the end, and it's those free half bond ends that are carrying the charge of the particle and are responsible for the mass. Now, in terms of the neutrinos, they're super light. And people always guessed, they've got these various estimates of what the size is. They've gotten better over the years. At first, they used to think they didn't have any mass at all. Well, it turns out that the neutrinos do not feel the electromagnetic force. And if you take the ratio of the weak force to the electromagnetic force, what you find out is that the neutrinos are 1/millionth of the mass of their electron counterparts. So the electron neutrino is 1/millionth of the mass of the electron. So how do we do in comparing these? So this chart shows you calculated versus expected ratios for the up quark, 100%. We're right on it. For the down quark, 97.9%. For the electron, we're at 100% of the value. That's really by definition there. And for the neutrino, it's been estimated to be less than 0.8 electron volts. And by this model, we get 0.5. So great fit to the data. I can also do that for the generation 2, generation 3 particles, as well as the bosons. That's a range of 10 to the 11th in mass. Okay. The neutrinos are kind of weird because they're feeling a different force. Even if we leave those out, we've got a 10 to the 5th difference in mass. For the formula I've got, the worst I'm off by is a factor of 8. So, if you look at these weights here, say that's a 1 kilogram weight, and in the back I've got one that's a little bigger. It's an 8 kilogram weight. That's how much I'm off by in a range that goes from that 1 kilogram weight to the mass of 12 Sam Houston statues put together. That's an incredibly good match. And not only that, it's not just that one, it's that all along the way, you have to hit close to the right points. So you can also use the end configurations of these because all the generation 1 particles basically look the same, right? They're a square and they all have 4 half bonds sticking off of them in various configurations. Yet they differ in charge. That tells you you should be able to calculate the charge based on those configurations. And so the way that we do that is break the structures up into substructures, parallel half bonds, diagonal half bonds, opposite side diagonal half bonds. And if you do that, you come up with a formula that correctly calculates those charges. And so that's that a charge for a particle is 1/2 of the same side diagonal plus 1/6 of the sum of the opposite side diagonal and the adjacent half bonds. Works. And it's known that charge is a function of weak isospin and half of the weak hypercharge. So actually, through that equation, you can calculate the weak isospin and weak hypercharge for all of the fermions, including their left and right chiralities, and for matter versus antimatter. So these structures actually get you those numbers. And then there's a fourth rule that you can come up with. It's not a complicated one that allows calculation of the bosons, the W, Z, and H bosons. Okay, so attaining fermion mass occurs through coupling to the Higgs field. And I think that, first think of the Higgs field as something that has a probability of a Higgs particle anywhere in it. And I think the mass is actually coming from connections to the Higgs particle. So some of these structures can actually bond directly to the Higgs boson, but other ones like the G1 fermions and the leptons, which are the electrons and the neutrinos, actually need to couple to a Z boson as an adapter so that you make this bond at the bottom here, blue to green, that holds them together. And then the Z boson uses its square to attach to the Higgs boson. So when you look at the spin of these things, the bosons are spin 1, the fermions are spin 1/2. How's that work? Looking at these structures. Well, it turns out that the bosons are made of both matter and antimatter. I know you think they should immediately annihilate. These particles actually don't stick around for very long. But in standard model, matter and antimatter are brought together. That's what the mesons are, for example, which are like an up quark and an anti-up quark, or an up quark and an anti-down quark put together. So there's precedent for that. So what you're doing is you're subtracting the spins. And so you get cancellation of 2 of the spins here on the charm, generation 2 fermion, and then you're left with a half. Over on the bosons, you've got matter and antimatter. Antimatter has negative spin. And so when you subtract those, they end up adding and you get spin 1. How about the Higgs boson? Well, the Higgs boson is perfectly symmetric. Everything's canceled out. And in fact, at relativistic speeds, the Higgs boson is going to look like a sphere. And what it means is that any rotation at all of the Higgs boson is a return to its starting position. All right, weak force. The way the weak force works is through these W bosons. So how does it work? Well, I've drawn at the top one of these kinds of reactions. So you take an up quark, and then you add in a W plus boson, and you get a down quark, and you get 2 other products, antimatter, a positron, and an electron neutrino. All the bonds are there to account for this as like a chemical reaction. So what happens is you're bringing in the up quark. I've color coded them in the second row so you can see where everything came from. So you're bringing in that up quark, and what's happening is that you are pushing the matter spinner against the antimatter spinner. And the W boson has only those 2 bonds in the center. So it's a weak structure. And I think what happens is it snaps, and the up quark then rearranges and becomes a down quark. And the first half of that W boson is the antimatter half. It becomes the positron, the antimatter. And then the other half becomes the electron neutrino. And there are, for second and third generation quarks, basically you just ripple this, this movement of half bonds down through the structure. Okay, so the idea of having matter and antimatter together leads to an idea of how you get particles together with fields. particle fields. So in the standard model, most people think that you got fields and particles are excitations in that field, that they're not really distinct. It's a peak coming along, some concentration of energy coming along in that field. I actually think that the particles are distinct. And now we've got a mechanism for doing that. And that's that if we take two fermions, matter and antimatter, when stick together, people say, okay, you annihilated an electron with a positron. Well, maybe what you did is you stuck those together and you made a W minus boson, spin 1. Neat thing about spin 1 particles is you can stack them one on top of another. They're superimposable, unlike the fermions. So you form what's called a Bose-Einstein condensate. It is basically a field. And then you can reverse the process. When you have pair production of particles, all of a sudden an electron and positron come out of the vacuum expectation value. I think what's happening there is that the W minus boson that's in this condensate is coming apart and producing the electron and positron that you then manifest. So I think the particles actually are real things. They're not just excitations in fields. There is a size to particles. So the fermions themselves, the quarks, are point-like until they are combined. At that point, they attain physicality. And I know you can't read all the stuff that's written there on the right, but the point is that when you check diameters of all sorts of particles, they fall on a straight line. And it turns out that once physicality is attained, one of these bonds works out to 0.346 femtometers. And you can use that to test predictions. So you get the correct diameter for a proton or neutron using the models here. If you use the standard model, you get the wrong number. It's off by quite a bit. And the spacing between nucleons, it's like how close two protons are within the nucleus, is exactly the space between the centers of two protons in this model. So it means that these things are binding directly to each other. You take one proton, you take its color charge on the end, and you stick that color charge smack up against the color charge of the other proton. That's not what the standard model says. Standard model says that between the protons, there's this mediator that allows them to hang together, and the mediator is called a meson. It's made of two quarks. In my model, it's just physically not possible. Their dimensions of this stuff add up wrong. What's happening is the protons are binding directly to each other, and the role of the meson is actually to separate the protons from one another. It inserts by sticking its color charge bonds in between the two protons. The meson is very short-lived. It falls apart. Meson's made out of matter and antimatter. It falls right apart. The protons are free to move around in the nuclear sac. The amount of force that the color charge has to at least compensate for the repulsive force between the protons. So that means that the color charge bond is at least 71 newtons in force. And we are just about done here. So what else can we do with this dream model? Well, it may solve some other problems. There's something known as the proton spin crisis. And in the proton spin crisis, if you sum up the spins of all of the quark contents, there's 3 quarks in there, should be they believe that's how you get a spin of a half for a proton. 2 of them cancel out and you're left with a half. But then they looked at how things behave when you align, when you polarize the protons. And their observation was off by 50%. They were expecting perfect alignment between the remaining quark and the alignment of the proton. And that's not what you get. It's 50-50. Well, the dream model can do that. So in the dream model, we've got these linear constructs, and they can be point oriented either way in that field. And so what you get is a 50-50 mix of the quark polarities. Cosmic hyperinflation of the universe is another thing that was postulated. The reason they came up with it was because the universe is very uniform in structure. And also a particle that something that was predicted to exist, a magnetic monopole, has never been observed. And so they thought, okay, greatly expand the universe, these things thin out, you won't see them. Well, the reason that they needed so much expansion, in their case, 10 to the 26th fold expansion of the universe, was because they're starting with a state where there is quantum fluctuations in the structure of the universe. Dream model does not start with that. Dream model starts with a perfectly flat, infinite sea of points. So we may not need so much expansion. And so if you look at the, if you say that the quark is made of a string and a string is 10 to the minus 35 meters or the Planck length, then the difference in the size of those works out to a factor of 10 to the 20th. And I would put to you that that is enough, starting from a uniform state, to explain the homogeneity of the universe now, as well as to thin out the magnetic monopoles so that they would be unobservable. So this may provide a mechanism by which hyperinflation of the universe occurred in the beginning. And with that, I'm at the end, and I am happy to take any questions you've got. Looks like we've got 25 minutes.
Hi, okay, I guess everybody can hear me. My mind is still in the pretzel here from his from the singer's joke to your presentation, but bear with me. Now, your dream model talks about matter and antimatter combining to form certain particles. Does this also tie in, or am I mixing up concepts here between the matter and antimatter imbalance observed in the universe?
All right, thank you for the question. Well, I think the imbalance of matter and antimatter is a separate issue. I had actually, if you review the second talk, I do cover that topic. So what happens is that for antimatter, basically it is anti-polar to the electric field. And so it can't stick around like that for very long. So I think that's what accounts for antimatter breaking down. It has to do with the way the spinners go and how the particle is aligned to the electric field. So that I believe is the reason for the difference. Other questions?
Yes, I was thinking, if you could bridge from where you are down or up, whichever direction it is, to the Niels Bohr atom and the periodic table of elements. It seems like that you invert a connection, and maybe you're talking about the stuff that makes those things. But I don't understand all I know about it. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, so we're way below that level. So we're at these point-like particles called quarks. And actually, I'm going down a level below that, down which are a long distance in terms of size, down to strings. So strings to quarks, put the quarks together, you start to get protons and neutrons. So it takes 3 quarks to make a proton or 3 quarks to make a neutron. And then those assemble in a nucleus, and you have a probability wave of an electron around all of that. And that's the atom. You start sticking atoms together, you get molecules, the molecules play around and you get us.
Hey, so if you had control of CERN, is there an experiment that you would like to run that would prove some of your predictions of the dream model versus the standard?
Yeah, so it's an important point is that any model needs to be testable. It needs to make predictions and get tested. Well, I think I've actually already done a little of that. My model predicted 3.5 colors and it fit the data, right? My model predicted that the charges of the particles have to do with the configuration of their ends, and it did, it worked.
Yeah.
So I think those are some predictions that were met, and I think, being able to get the rest masses to the degree that I did when there's such an enormous range is another good test. But there are some others that we might be able to do. One speculation is that between the generation 2 and generation 3 fermions, there may be dibosons. So like a ZZ boson, those two stuck together. And it should be possible from the model to predict what the mass of that would be. And I had done this in my original draft many years ago, and I'm sorry, I don't recall what I ended up with a rest mass and whether that would be something that could actually be attained in a particle accelerator. I think the answer was yes, that it would be within range. That would definitely be an experiment I would like to see done to look for the double bosons.
Hey, Eric, thanks for all your work and all your work on the presentations, really fascinating implications. At this point, what are your next steps as far as getting some physicists to look at your model and give you feedback on it? And what, I suppose experimental physics, in addition to predicting things, which you've done, what about experimental physics to see if they can falsify, falsifiable stuff?
Yeah. So we just touched on that last point a bit. When you're dealing with things that are so minutely small, it gets very difficult to make observations on them. But there are some predictions that stem from the model. In terms of where I go to next with this, well, once I've got the third talk recorded, I have an individual in mind who is a field theorist who I believe is amenable to reviewing the theory. I started out writing a 10-page paper and I ended up with a book. So, I don't want to just slam him with a book. So my goal is to have all of these talks ready and say, okay, look at this, see if there's anything in there that strikes your interest. If there's something that's clearly wrong, let me know. If there's something that needs to be adjusted, let me know. We can work on it together, turn it into a manuscript. There is a reservoir of would-be articles called archive. As a molecular biologist, I have standing to put draft articles into archive for biology. I do not have that privilege for physics. So I need a real honest to goodness physicist on board on this, turn it into a draft publication, get it on archive where it is publicly viewable by the scientific community and open to comment. Hopefully from there, get it into a final form that makes it into a journal. But if it only gets as far as archive, I'd be delighted.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Well, actually, I was going to ask this question. So glad to hear you're also a molecular biologist. You made a comment, we get to molecules and then us. So if you take a few steps back to the cell level, can you comment on what's the difference with living and non-living? Is that kind of built up in the model that you have at some point, or what basically makes life in that form of definition?
Yeah, that's a whole nother talk, which I actually gave here many years ago on origin of life and how you went from cyclic chemistries and putting systems together to get something that is bona fide alive. And it really becomes a philosophical question as well. I mean, a lot of people would not consider an inert virus sitting as dried up powder in a vial to be alive. And by itself, it's not. but turn it loose inside a cell where it's got helpers, it's alive. So, there's a philosophical answer to that as well.
Wow. Okay, here's the last question from Ted.
Yeah, Eric, thanks for the great talk. Just out of curiosity, I know that acronyms are often kind of forced and stuff, but I don't know if you mentioned at any time where the DREAM, dream, comes in, and if we would understand how that came about.
Yeah, so I played with lots of acronyms. The translation of that was actually on the first slide for each of the talks. A little footnote down there, but so it's a dimensional release of 8 assembly modules. So when you break a point up, you get these 8 prions. Those are the assembly modules. If somebody comes up with a better name, I'm all for it. But I like that, you went from nothing to something, and it really is sort of a dream transition. So I went with it, but I am open to suggestions.
All right, thank you so much. We really appreciate you sharing this with us.
Thank you all.
So let's start. We have our musical guest today is Robert Kuhn, a native Houstonian. He's toured all over the USA and Mexico and played many kinds of music, ranging from folk to reggae to blues. In August 2019, while on the road to Colorado, Robert was in a nearly fatal car wreck that left him in critical condition. He returned to Galveston 6 weeks later, hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt, happy to be alive, and with the motivation to create his latest album, Persevere. So without any further ado, welcome a returning performer to Oasis, Robert Kuhn. Thank you.
Early in the morning, I take my prisoner down to the waterside. I always say thank you before I go under, and they look at me like I am the madman. What if there was a place that we could go to? There was a way to get there. What if I surrender? Cranes of origami hanging in the window. Despite what they say in the streets, they still look much the same. The landlords are selling, the rents are raising. We got to keep on moving. What if there was a place that we could go to? If there was a way to get there, what if I surrender? But if there was a place that we could go to, but if there was a way to get there, but if there was a place that we could go to, what if there was a way to get there? What if I surrender?